Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales About History, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. Maybe you know somebody who has a ham radio in their house and speaks with people literally all over the world. And they do it using the very same technology that enables radio, TV, Wi-Fi, and a host of other technologies, radio waves. In fact, it's what makes your cell phone work. Well, it's not just all fun and games, although it is fun, but there's also a component to it that's dedicated to helping society during natural disasters when all other communication systems have failed. Ham radio is a fascinating world, and here to tell us all about it are two representatives of the American Radio Relay League that represents ham radio operators across the country. Sierra Harrop is Public Relations and Outreach Manager, and Joe Karsha is manager of the Newington, Connecticut-based main amateur radio station that they operate. They'll be along in just a moment. This week's trivia question, the question is, what do corkscrews, erector sets, and stone-crushing machines have in common? Well, stay tuned after the main program for the answer. That'll give you the topic for next week's show. Well, as some of you know by now, I'm a former radio guy. I spent the first 15 years of my career as a radio journalist, broadcasting on both AM and FM radio stations in Connecticut and Massachusetts. Radio stations, of course, are regulated by the FCC, better known as the Federal Communications Commission. Well, there's another level of radio stations you may or may not have heard about, also overseen by the FCC, and it's called amateur radio, or ham radio. It's where individuals actually broadcast on their own radio stations from their homes. They just have to use special frequencies that are assigned for this so they don't interfere with the radio station signals you find on your car radio or your home radio receiver. Well, humans discovered the existence of electromagnetic radio waves back in the 1800s, and they are the basis for all modern communications: radio, TV, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cell phone, citizens band radio, also known as CB radio, and yes, ham radio. The guy who first theorized the existence of these electromagnetic fields was a Scotsman, James Clerk Maxwell. His theory published in 1873. Now, you've probably heard the terms megahertz, kilohertz, or gigahertz, and that's because it was a German physicist who was able to prove Maxwell's theory of electromagnetic waves about 15 years after that theory was published, and his name was Heinrich Hertz. Well, then an Italian got involved in these discoveries, and in 1896, an engineer that you've heard of named Marconi went to London and demonstrated that he could send a message 2 miles away from where he was standing without using any wires. That's right, wireless communication was hence born. And in 1901, Marconi succeeded in sending a message from Europe to the United States across the Atlantic Ocean without any wires. Now, amateur radio operators began using this new technology almost immediately, but it wasn't until 1914 that a Hartford, Connecticut man, Hiram Percy Maxim, established a process that would make amateur radio broadcasting effective, or ham radio as it's also known. Now, shortly after that, the American Radio Relay League was formed, based near Hartford in the town of Newington. Today's interview with two of ARRL's representatives was done while they were at the site where W1AW broadcasts from. It's the station for the national organization. With us today are Sierra Harrop, she's Public Relations and Outreach Manager, and Joe Karsha, who's manager of that Newington, Connecticut-based main amateur radio station. So Sierra and Joe, it is great to have you on the program because all of our communications, whether or not we know it or not, come around electromagnetic fields that were developed theoretically back in the late 1800s, and we've gotten very sophisticated since then. But I want to start off with a very basic question. We call people who have these amateur radio stations in their house, we call them ham radio operators. Sierra, can you give me an idea where that word comes from?
Sure, it was an insult originally, back when railroad telegraphers first became wireless operators in the early 1900s. At the same time, people were taking up wireless as a hobby, and they were not very good senders of telegraphy. And so there was a pejorative among railroad telegraphers, ham-fisted. And so when all these amateur stations came on the radio waves and were using Morse code over the air and not doing it very well, all the old pros called them hams, short for ham-fisted. And amateur radio operators at the time kind of looked around and said, you know what? Yeah, we'll take it. And they ran with ham as a badge of honor, and it has continued all these years later from its origins and in the very early 1900s.
Now, I want to just make sure that we don't lose the audience on something, and I want to make sure I set this up right before we get into the next line of questioning, which is simply, and you said something very important, Sierra, when you use the word wireless. And for so many years, all of our communications, the first telephone with Thomas Edison and all that, it was with wires. And then when you had, as you said, telegraphy, these were people who operated a telegraph, usually in the old days between railroad stations where they would punch out Morse code, again, over a wire. This was used during the Civil War. And then all of a sudden in the late 1800s, this is when this whole field of wireless came into play. And this was a phenomenon that is kind of underappreciated today, and it plays into so much that we're going to get into. I just wanted to make sure we kind of got into this. Now, everybody knows radio stations, and I think that's where they stop, with their thought of radio. But it's really so much more than that. But in a way, amateur radio operators are really like operating a radio station on a different frequency, right?
Oh, absolutely. And everybody in modern life operates a series of radio stations. If you think about your cell phone, well, it's got a wireless connection, it's got a Wi-Fi connection, it's got a Bluetooth connection. Each one of those is a different radio. They're bound together in this neat little box with a screen, and we use it to send pictures to each other and make phone calls and send texts, but that's all via wireless technology. If you're listening to this podcast on Wi-Fi, you are operating a radio. And so what ham radio operators do, amateur radio operators, we take advantage of chunks of radio frequency that are kind of in between, say, the cell phones and the TVs and the AM broadcast stations. There's frequencies in there that are allocated for amateur use. And we kind of think about those frequencies almost like the national parks of radio. They're set aside from commercial use. They're set aside for recreational use. We can use them, we can enjoy them, we can't profit off of them, but we can make use of this natural resource that is the electromagnetic spectrum. And if people think that ham radio is different from what they do, I'd point them right to their cell phone or their home Wi-Fi network, because everybody's using radio. We just forget about it now that the antennas have gotten smaller and internal.
Very good point. Now, both of you were in your teens when you first got interested in amateur radio. Joe, when did the bug bite you, and what was it that drew you toward amateur radio operations?
Well, I would have to say I was, first off, the nerd in the family. I was actually doing what was called AM SWLing, or AM shortwave listening. I had this clunky old radio. This is when I was quite young, and I would listen to AM broadcast stations. As the day progressed, stations that were local to me that I was able to receive with no problem suddenly became a little distant, and now distant stations hundreds of miles away on AM broadcast, I would start to receive. And so that's where I actually got bitten by the bug. And thankfully, my parents supported that hobby by always getting me these little crystal radio kits. But it wasn't until my father actually started to learn about Morse code, and he started talking about amateur radio. And I thought, oh, this is cool, because not only can I receive, but I can also transmit, and I can talk to these people. It helped getting me, this job here as the station manager of W1AW.
I want to go back and talk about this American Radio Relay League and why is it called Radio Relay. This was actually a Hartford guy named Hiram Percy Maxim. And Sierra, can you tell us a story? I guess there were limited ranges for the first amateur radios, and you couldn't really send a message, say, from Hartford to California, and you had to rely on others. Is that the gist of it?
That's it. The relay aspect really comes into the name. And of course, these days we go by ARL, the National Association for Amateur Radio, but we trace our roots back to Hiram Percy Maxim. He had the call sign 1AW. We carry that on here as W1AW. He was trying to send a message from Hartford, and he was trying to reach a friend in Springfield. And if you think about that, that's not very far. These days, it's a 20-minute drive and a quick phone call away. But if you consider in the 19 teens, it was a feat to get a message. And so he was trying to communicate with a friend there. The band conditions, the radio conditions just didn't let it happen. And he thought, well, what if there was somebody in between that could take my message? They could hear it, say, in Enfield or Windsor Locks or somewhere up there, and relay it, because maybe they could hear it from Springfield if it was one of those northern Hartford County stations relaying it. And so he created what we know today as the National Traffic System. In its infancy, it was just a matter of you copy down what I say verbatim, and you send it to the next station verbatim, and it keeps on going down the line until it gets to the receiving station. And that is still in place today. Anybody can find an amateur radio operator in their neighborhood and say, hey, I have a message I would like to get to literally anywhere else in the world. And they will go on their nightly net. You send your traffic in. It's acknowledged verbatim. It's handled very formally, almost like an old telegram. It goes up to a regional net, which goes to an area net, and it gets transmitted to the part of the country or the part of the world where it needs to go, and then it goes back down one of these local nets and usually winds up with a local ham in the receiving area, picking up the phone call and calling somebody and having to explain a little bit about, what this is and how this message got to them. But it serves in a way to get messages reliably back and forth when perhaps if there was an internet outage or the phone system was down or something happened, radio still works when all else fails.
Let's talk about the public service part for just a second. Joe, I mean, obviously, as a hobby, it's fun. You can do it, and you can play an important role in this relaying of messages. When it comes to public service, a disaster, tell me about a time when you've been involved in a situation like this. What do you do, and what kind of role do you play, and how does that contribute to helping during the disaster?
Well, the first thing I'd like to point out is that amateur radio has always been secondary to formal communications. And by that I mean emergency management operations, fire, police, medical. We are there to say we can provide secondary communications or secondary communication backup should the need arise, but we're always there. And we actually have training sessions. I realize that, some of your listeners, some folks out there say, well, it's just a hobby. Yes, there's no denying that it is a hobby. However, there is a service aspect to amateur radio as well, and one of the services we provide is this emergency communications. And, just last year, for example, when Helene came through, there was this one amateur radio operator in North Carolina that was literally the only source, at least at the time, of communications for his area. All the other systems were knocked out. All the cell sites were knocked out. There was no electricity. There was nothing. And he was utilizing amateur radio to get messages in and out of the affected areas. And he did that because he understood that amateur radio provides a role in communications. One that I was involved in, actually a few of them, there was Hurricane Katrina. After that was Hurricane Maria. And here at W1AW, we don't come in and say, we're here now, we're here to save the day. Rather, we will check into what are called amateur radio nets. These are on-the-air gatherings to say, okay, if assistance is required, W1AW is here. When Marie hit, we were providing this communications to where we were checking into amateur radio nets that were taking place in the Caribbean. Amateur radio operators in Puerto Rico were able to establish an amateur radio station, and so they were getting the names and telephone numbers of individuals here in the States. And what they were doing is they were going onto these nets and saying, okay, we have these, say, 15 people here in Connecticut. Here's their names and addresses. We got them from these people here. They literally just want to tell their family or friends that they are okay. So what we would do is we get on these frequencies, we get onto these nets, get this information, and then from here, we would call these people here in the States, identify who we are, tell them, no, it's not a scam. We're not asking for car insurance. Rather, we have information from these people in the affected area, and we just want to let you know, or they want you to know, that they are okay. And that was it. For us there was this sense of pride, but also knowing that we were utilizing amateur radio to help people. It didn't matter that we couldn't get back to the other individual and say, yeah, we passed your message. That wasn't the point. The point was we were able to get this information via amateur radio and pass it on to others. The other aspect of it, we were setting up emergency stations to send down to Puerto Rico. We were working with the Red Cross. The Red Cross actually came to us to say, we need you folks to essentially vet 50 people that can be sent down there as amateur radio operators to be located in strategic points to provide this emergency communication aspect. Because as you all recall, when Maria hit, everything was gone.
And one thing I'd like to follow on with that is, the real value of amateur radio during emergencies is established well ahead of time. We have memorandums of understanding with a lot of federal agencies, with FEMA, with SAFECOM, with people like the Red Cross, with people like the Salvation Army. We build relationships at the National Association level during blue skies so that when there is an emergency, the plan's already in place. Everybody's trained, everybody's ready to go, everybody has their equipment tested, we have it ready, and it just goes into place. During hurricanes, there's what's called the Hurricane Watch Net, which is a 60-year-old organization that is volunteers all around the North American continent and around the Caribbean that participate in providing real-time surface observations to the National Hurricane Center. There's a ham radio station at the National Hurricane Center. And when there's a hurricane, there's a ham radio volunteer sitting there providing real-time information, because with satellites and with hurricane hunter flights and with radar, you get really good measurements up in the clouds. But ham radio operators are at the surface, and in a severe weather event, surface observations make all the difference in the world. There's story after story of hams on the island of Cuba and Hispaniola and other places that radio in and say, hey, you know what, the wind's forecast to be out of this direction, but really it's coming from this other direction. And that tells the hurricane forecasters that, you know what, maybe our forecast is shifting, maybe things are different. And it informs the warning process in real time. And then in the post-hurricane, it also provides that Joe was talking about, that health and welfare traffic, and lets people know their loved ones are alive.
On an amateur frequency, there is what's called the Maritime Net. And this is a place, it's a specific frequency that amateur radio operators meet that deals specifically with amateur radio operators who happen to be in their boats, in their sailboats, to provide a place where if someone happens to be out in the water, they're fortunate enough to be a ham and have a station on board. If something were to occur, obviously they're not going to be able to have any cell service, and maybe or maybe not they have satellite service, but they do have amateur radio. And so if something happens, hopefully it's easy enough for them to check into this Maritime Net to say, hey, I'm located here with this specific location, I have an engine failure. And through the Maritime Net, they will contact the Coast Guard.
Now, Sierra, you were in Oklahoma at one point during your life, and actually was a storm chaser in one of your earlier lives. And so I'm wondering if you could just tell us how that works with amateur radio.
Yeah, I used to be employed as a television storm chaser in Oklahoma City, and what got me into that was ham radio. I witnessed a severe tornado outbreak on May 3rd, 1999. A big set of tornadoes tore up my home state of Oklahoma, and I was listening on ham radio. My mom was a ham, my dad was a ham, and we had a ham radio in the car, and I was listening to the ham radio reports come into the National Weather Service in Norman, Oklahoma, with real-time tracking of this mile-wide tornado, and I realized that I wanted to be a part of helping keep people safe during that, and that's what led me into amateur radio to begin with. And the way that National Weather Service offices use ham radio is a lot of the spotters through the Skywarn program. If something meets severe weather criteria, we radio it back through the amateur radio net, and then that's given to the National Weather Service warning forecast meteorologists at the field offices so that they can know, hey, we've got a trained amateur radio volunteer through the Skywarn program that has witnessed something that we know to meet severe weather criteria. And they'll actually issue a severe weather warning. Maybe it's a severe thunderstorm warning or a tornado warning. They'll issue those warnings based on these vetted reports from ham radio operators. And it happens in real time.
The whole idea of wireless communication is, again, something that everybody can relate to because of their cell phones and can get a taste of what that means. But what you guys do that I think is very interesting as well is you actually are able to communicate with the space shuttle, for example. We're going to be using radio waves if we ever want to go to Mars. We search for radio signals from far off galaxies in outer space because that's the communication we would be able to pick up. And sometimes we do pick up signals that we can't yet explain or decipher, but they're out there. Maybe just comment on all of this as a sort of a big picture area of radio operations.
We tend to think of communications as, you turn on your radio, you hit the microphone, you hit the Morse Code key, and you're transmitting. But it's not as simple as that. Depending upon where you want to communicate, how you want to communicate, a lot of that is frequency specific. During the day, you can hear AM stations that may be local to you. At nighttime, because conditions change, you are hearing stations from hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. Well, that effect is throughout the entire electromagnetic spectrum. And so if we were going to talk to stations in Mars once we colonize it, we wouldn't be using necessarily what are called HF or high frequencies. We would be using VHF, if not microwave frequencies, which amateur radio operators do have an allocation on. So we would need individuals to understand how microwaves work.
And one little thing for your listeners, in our lobby, there is a trophy called the Elser Mathis Cup. It was envisioned in 1929 to commemorate the first two-way amateur radio contact between Earth and Mars. So when we get to Mars and when we put a ham radio station on Mars, there is this trophy that's almost 100 years old that's ready to be awarded, and it sits right here in Connecticut.
So right now we're going to provide a little example of what ham radio actually sounds like. Just to set your expectations properly, it can often be hard to make out the words, and other times the words are actually pretty clear. Now here's a ham radio operator leading other operators in a group session, and he's welcoming a new group member.
We've also got a new station that's joined us from Alabama today. Let's introduce Val to the group. I want you to ask the question, who hears me? And then just listen. Don't say anything. The guys will come back and give you a signal report and location. That'll let you know where you're getting out to at this moment in time, Val. So it's your turn to go. Go ahead.
So that new operator gives out his call signals, and the others, many of whom were very far away, respond back one by one to tell them they can hear him. Now, keep in mind, this newcomer is from the southern state of Alabama, and to help you understand what you're about to hear, because it's really difficult to hear, especially if you're not used to these types of transmissions, there's going to be 4 replies from Northern California, Ohio, Connecticut, and Tennessee.
Well, in the state of Alabama, 2 years in Northern California, 5 for Ohio, Ralph. You're 5 and 7 in Connecticut. Right down here in Tennessee.
It sort of sounds like the first transmissions when Neil Armstrong set foot on the lunar surface back in the 1960s. Well, that group that Sierra and Joe works for is supporting teachers in the STEM fields of science so they can teach the next generation of children, the ones that are going to take us back to the moon and eventually to Mars, all the time using the same wireless communication technologies that ham operators use today. Now, for starters, they're going to need to understand why it takes 27 minutes for a radio signal to make its way from Mother Earth to the red planet of Mars. wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales About History. Now, if you want to get involved with ham radio, it's actually relatively inexpensive and quick to get your license and a home station set up. Just contact the National Association for Amateur Radio in Newington. They'll get you all set up. And I want to thank our guests for today's program, Sierra Harrop, who's Public Relations and Outreach Manager for that group, and Joe Karsha, who manages the Newington, Connecticut-based Maine Amateur Radio Station. Well, the answer to this week's trivia question, what do corkscrews, erector sets, and stone crushing machines have in common? Well, they were all invented in New Haven, Connecticut. Next week on Amazing Tales, you're going to find that so were a large number of other things, some of them rather zany and others crucial for society's development. Going to hear all about them next week. Amazing Tales About History is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.